The moment my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said I should never have come, I realized this dinner was never meant to be a celebration. My name is Margaret Collins, and at 67 years old, I thought I had lived through enough heartbreak to recognize trouble before it arrived. I was wrong. The evening started with something as ordinary as an invitation. My son Daniel had called me 3 weeks earlier and asked if I would join him and his wife Ashley for dinner at a new restaurant downtown. It was a place everyone in town seemed to be talking about, one of those modern American steakhouses with soft lighting, polished wood tables, and reservations booked months in advance. Daniel told me they were celebrating a major promotion at work, and he wanted family together for the occasion. Hearing those words meant more to me than I could explain. Over the past year, our relationship had grown distant. Nothing dramatic had happened. At least, not openly. The phone calls became shorter. Holiday visits became less frequent. Invitations seemed to disappear. Every time I asked if everything was all right, Daniel assured me it was. Still, a mother knows when something has changed. That invitation felt like a chance to reconnect. On the evening of the dinner, I spent more time getting ready than I cared to admit. I chose a navy blue dress I usually saved for special occasions and a silver necklace that had belonged to my late mother. Looking in the mirror before leaving, I felt nervous, which seemed ridiculous at my age. But when family relationships become fragile, even simple dinners can feel important. The restaurant was about 25 minutes from my home. During the drive, I imagined the evening ahead. I pictured Daniel smiling the way he used to. I imagined conversation, laughter, and maybe the feeling that our family was finding its way back to each other. When I arrived, the parking lot was already crowded. Through the large front windows, I could see groups of people gathered around tables, enjoying their Friday night. The hostess greeted me warmly and escorted me toward a private dining section near the back. That was when I saw them. Daniel was seated at the center of the table. Ashley sat beside him. Several of Ashley's relatives were there too, people I had met only a handful of times. For a brief moment I smiled. Then I noticed something strange. Nobody looked surprised to see me. Nobody looked happy either. Daniel stood and gave me a quick hug, but it felt rushed. Ashley offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. The atmosphere felt colder than the air-conditioned room around us. I told myself I was imagining things. I took my seat and tried to relax. For the first 15 minutes, conversation moved normally enough. People discussed work, vacations, and local events. But every time I spoke, Ashley found a way to redirect the conversation elsewhere. When I complimented the restaurant, she immediately changed the subject. When I asked Daniel about his promotion, she answered for him. Small moments. Easy to dismiss. Yet together they created a feeling I couldn't ignore. It was as though I had been invited to the table but was not truly welcome there. As appetizers arrived and glasses clinked around me, I began to wonder why I felt like a guest at my own son's celebration. What I didn't know then was that the worst moment of the night was already approaching, and before dinner was over, every person in that restaurant would be staring at our table. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach and focus on the reason we were all there. Daniel had worked hard for his promotion, and I wanted the evening to be about him. The waiter arrived to take our dinner orders, and for a few minutes the conversation settled into something that almost felt normal. I listened as Ashley described a recent weekend trip and as her brother talked about a new business venture. Daniel nodded along, occasionally smiling, but there was something distant in his expression. It was the same look I had noticed during our phone calls over the past year, as if he was constantly measuring every word before speaking. When the waiter reached me, I ordered a grilled salmon entree with vegetables and a side salad. Ashley glanced at me and laughed softly. It was not a loud laugh, but it was enough to draw attention. One of her relatives smiled as though they understood a private joke. I pretended not to notice. A few minutes later, Ashley began telling a story about family boundaries. At first, it sounded like a general discussion, but before long it became obvious she was speaking about me without using my name. She described mothers who could not let go of their adult children. She talked about parents who inserted themselves into situations where they did not belong. Each sentence was delivered with a pleasant smile, but every word felt carefully aimed. I sat quietly and sipped my water. Daniel stared down at the table. The more Ashley spoke, the more uncomfortable I became. What bothered me most was not her criticism. It was the realization that nobody seemed surprised by it. It felt rehearsed somehow, as though everyone else knew the script except me. Then Ashley looked directly at me and asked a question. She wanted to know whether I believed parents should always have access to every part of their children's lives. The table suddenly became very quiet. I answered honestly. I told her that adult children deserve independence and privacy, but families should still care about one another. It seemed like a reasonable response. Ashley smiled again, but this time there was something sharp behind it. She thanked me for my opinion in a tone that suggested she did not value it at all. The conversation moved on, yet the tension remained. As dinner service began, I noticed small details that made me increasingly uneasy. Ashley would whisper something to the person beside her, and they would glance in my direction. Someone would mention a topic connected to family disagreements, and then quickly look away. It felt as though I had walked into a room where a discussion had already taken place before I arrived. I started wondering whether my invitation had truly come from Daniel alone. When our meals finally arrived, the table briefly relaxed. The aroma of grilled steak, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread filled the air. Around us, other diners laughed and enjoyed their evenings. For a moment, I hoped I had been overthinking everything. Then Ashley raised her glass and proposed a toast. Everyone turned toward her. She began by congratulating Daniel on his success. She spoke about ambition, hard work, and building a future. Then her tone changed. She started talking about negative influences, old habits, and people who refused to move on from the past. The smile on her face never disappeared, but the warmth in her voice vanished completely. I felt every eye at the table shift toward me. My heart sank. Whatever was happening that night had not been spontaneous. It had been building for a long time, and I was beginning to understand that I was the target. The silence after Ashley finished her toast felt heavier than any argument I had ever experienced. Nobody spoke. Nobody laughed. Even the people at neighboring tables seemed quieter, as though they could sense something uncomfortable hanging in the air. I forced a small smile and thanked her for the kind words about Daniel, hoping the evening could still be saved. For a moment, I thought perhaps I was imagining the hostility. Then Ashley set down her glass and looked directly at me. There was no smile now. No attempt to hide what she was feeling. "You know," she said loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, "some people never understand when it is time to step aside." A few of her relatives shifted in their seats. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but he still said nothing. I felt my chest tighten. I asked calmly what she meant. Ashley leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "I mean that some people keep showing up where they are not wanted." The words landed like a punch to my confidence. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to say something, anything, but he stared at the table. The disappointment hurt more than Ashley's comments ever could. I had spent years raising him, supporting him, encouraging him through every challenge life placed in front of him. Yet in that moment, I felt completely alone. Ashley continued speaking. She began listing examples of what she called interference. She mentioned family gatherings, holiday visits, and phone calls. Every example was exaggerated or twisted. Situations that had been completely ordinary were suddenly presented as evidence that I was somehow controlling or intrusive. The more she talked, the more I realized this was not a spontaneous outburst. She had been collecting grievances for months, maybe years. What frightened me was how confident she sounded. She truly believed every word she was saying. One of her relatives nodded in agreement. Another quietly murmured support. I felt as though I had walked into a courtroom where a verdict had already been reached before the trial began. I tried to defend myself without creating a scene. I explained that I had always respected their space. I reminded everyone that most of my visits had happened only after invitations. I spoke softly because I did not want to embarrass Daniel on what was supposed to be his special evening. Ashley laughed again. This time there was no attempt to hide the mockery. "That is exactly what I mean," she said. "You always act innocent." The accusation stunned me. I had no idea what she believed I had done. The conversation was no longer about specific events. It had become something much deeper. Something emotional. Something personal. Around us, plates clinked and servers moved through the restaurant, but our table felt isolated from the rest of the world. Then Ashley said something that changed everything. She claimed there were reasons she did not trust me, reasons she had never fully explained to Daniel. The statement caught everyone off guard. Even her own relatives looked surprised. My heart began racing. I searched my memory, trying to understand what she could possibly mean. Had I unknowingly offended her years ago? Had someone told her something untrue? Before I could ask, Ashley shook her head and said she was tired of pretending. The room seemed to shrink around me. Daniel finally looked up, but instead of speaking, he appeared confused. It was the first sign that perhaps he did not fully understand what was happening either. In that moment, I realized the dinner was no longer about a promotion, a celebration, or even family. It had become something else entirely. And whatever secret resentment Ashley had been carrying all these years was finally about to come into the open. Ashley took a slow breath and looked around the table as though she was preparing to reveal something everyone else should have known years ago. The confidence in her expression made me uneasy because it was the look of someone who believed she finally had proof. "Daniel deserves to know the truth," she said. Her voice was steady now, no longer emotional, which somehow made it more alarming. Daniel frowned. "What truth?" he asked. Ashley hesitated for a moment before answering. "The truth about why I have never trusted your mother." A knot formed in my stomach. I searched my memory again and again, trying to understand where this was coming from. I had never had a major argument with Ashley. We had disagreements like any family, but nothing that could explain the level of resentment she was displaying. Ashley reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The sight of it immediately captured everyone's attention. She placed it on the table but kept one hand over it. "For years," she said, "I have been carrying something that I never wanted to discuss. I kept hoping it would not matter. I kept hoping I could move on. But every time Margaret acted like the perfect mother, I remembered this." Daniel stared at the paper. "Ashley, what are you talking about?" She looked directly at him. "I am talking about your family. I am talking about things that happened long before you and I got married." My pulse quickened. The relatives seated around the table exchanged confused glances. Whatever they had expected, this was clearly not it. Ashley slowly removed her hand from the paper. "When I was a teenager, my mother told me a story about a woman who destroyed lives and walked away pretending she had done nothing wrong." I blinked in confusion. The statement made no sense. Ashley continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. She explained that her mother had spent years warning her about certain people. According to Ashley, there had been someone connected to her family decades ago. Someone whose decisions had created enormous pain. Someone whose name, she claimed, had surfaced repeatedly whenever old family stories were discussed. Then she looked directly at me. "That name was Margaret." The accusation hung in the air. For a second I genuinely thought there must be another Margaret she was referring to. I shook my head. "Ashley, I have no idea what you are talking about." But she did not seem interested in my answer. Instead, she began describing fragments of stories she had heard growing up. None of them sounded familiar. Different cities. Different circumstances. Different people. Yet somehow she had become convinced they all connected back to me. Daniel looked bewildered. "Ashley, this cannot be right." She turned toward him. "That is exactly what I thought at first. But every time I asked questions, I heard the same name again." I could see uncertainty beginning to spread around the table. Even Ashley's relatives appeared uncomfortable now. The certainty she had displayed earlier was starting to create more questions than answers. Then something happened that I did not expect. Daniel asked a simple question. Did you ever verify any of this? Ashley opened her mouth but did not answer immediately. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough for me to notice. For the first time all evening, a crack appeared in her confidence. Daniel leaned forward. Ashley, did you actually confirm any of these stories? She looked away. That tiny movement changed everything. Because in that moment, I realized something important. Ashley was not acting from facts. She was acting from belief. From assumptions. From stories she had accepted as truth years ago. And if those stories were wrong, then the foundation of her anger might be wrong too. The realization did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel sad. Because suddenly I understood that whatever had poisoned our relationship had started long before either of us realized it. And somewhere in the past, hidden behind decades of misunderstanding, there was a missing piece of the story that neither of us had yet uncovered. The atmosphere at the table changed after Daniel's question. For the first time that evening, Ashley seemed uncertain. She looked down at the folded paper in front of her, and then back at the faces around her. Nobody was nodding anymore. Nobody was encouraging her to continue. They were waiting for answers. Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but firm. He asked where the information had come from. Ashley explained that most of it came from conversations with her mother over the years. She said there had been stories, warnings, and repeated references to someone named Margaret who had supposedly caused serious damage within their extended family decades earlier. As she spoke, I listened carefully. The details still sounded unfamiliar. Then, suddenly, one small detail caught my attention. Ashley mentioned a town in northern Ohio. My heart skipped a beat. I had lived there briefly when I was in my early 20s. It was more than 40 years ago. The moment she mentioned the town, fragments of old memories surfaced. Faces I had not thought about in decades. Neighbors. Friends. People whose names had faded with time. But none of those memories involved anything remotely resembling the accusations Ashley believed. I slowly asked a question. Ashley, did your mother ever mention the last name of this Margaret? Ashley looked surprised. After a moment, she answered. It was not Collins. It was a completely different surname. Several people at the table exchanged confused glances. I felt a strange mix of relief and concern. Relief because the woman being described clearly was not me. Concern because Ashley had apparently spent years building resentment toward the wrong person. Daniel immediately noticed the inconsistency. He pointed out that I had never used that surname. Ashley tried to explain that she believed the woman might have remarried later. It sounded possible in theory, but the confidence she had displayed earlier was beginning to weaken. The conversation shifted from accusation to investigation. For the first time, people started asking questions instead of simply accepting assumptions. One of Ashley's relatives asked whether any photographs existed. Another asked whether anyone had ever directly connected me to the stories beyond sharing the same first name. Ashley admitted she had never found any official proof. Her mother had simply been convinced. As the discussion continued, another memory surfaced in my mind. There had been a family in that Ohio town who experienced a painful falling out many years ago. I vaguely remembered hearing neighbors gossip about it. At the time, I had barely known the people involved. Yet the timeline Ashley described sounded remarkably similar. The more details she shared, the more convinced I became that she had spent years associating me with events connected to someone else entirely. I could see Daniel reaching the same conclusion. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. Not concern about himself. Concern about both of us. He looked at Ashley and asked why she had never discussed these suspicions openly before. Her answer surprised everyone. She said she had been afraid. Afraid that if she brought it up, Daniel would dismiss her concerns. Afraid that she would look unreasonable. Afraid that she might discover the stories were true. Listening to her, I realized something important. Beneath all the anger, there was fear. Fear had been quietly shaping her view of me for years. Every awkward interaction, every misunderstanding, every disagreement had been filtered through a belief she already carried. Suddenly, many of the tensions between us started making sense. But even as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, one question remained unanswered. If the stories had originated with Ashley's mother, where had her mother learned them? Because the more we examined the details, the clearer it became that someone, somewhere in the past, had either misunderstood the truth or deliberately changed it. And that missing answer was about to lead us toward a far bigger revelation than anyone at the table expected. The question about Ashley's mother lingered over the table like a storm cloud. Nobody seemed interested in food anymore. Plates sat untouched while everyone focused on the conversation that had completely taken over the evening. Ashley looked exhausted now, as though years of emotion were finally catching up with her. Daniel gently asked whether her mother was still in contact with anyone from that period in Ohio. Ashley nodded slowly and said there was one person. An older aunt named Linda. According to her, Linda had always been the family historian, the relative who remembered every story, every relationship, and every disagreement. One of Ashley's cousins immediately suggested calling her. At first the idea sounded ridiculous. It was a Friday evening, and none of us wanted to drag an elderly woman into a family dispute. But the more we discussed it, the more it seemed like the only way to separate facts from assumptions. Ashley hesitated before finally taking out her phone. The call lasted several rings before someone answered. Ashley briefly explained the situation and then switched the phone to speaker mode. What happened next changed the entire direction of the evening. Linda listened quietly while Ashley summarized the stories she had grown up hearing. When Ashley mentioned my name, there was a long pause. Then Linda asked a question that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Margaret Collins?" Ashley answered yes. Another pause followed. "No," Linda finally said. "That is not the woman your mother was talking about." The silence around the table became absolute. Ashley looked stunned. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment as though trying to process what he had just heard. Linda continued speaking. She explained that decades earlier there had indeed been another woman named Margaret connected to a painful family situation. However, the surname was completely different, the age was different, and the family connection was entirely unrelated to mine. According to Linda, confusion had started years later when someone casually mentioned another Margaret during a family gathering. Over time, details became mixed together. Assumptions replaced facts. Stories were repeated so many times that people stopped questioning them. Ashley's face lost all color. "Are you saying my mother misunderstood?" she asked. Linda sighed. "I think your mother believed what she was saying. But I also think she inherited an inaccurate version of the story." The answer hit everyone hard. For Ashley, it meant years of resentment had been built on a foundation that was never verified. For me, it meant the distance that had grown between us might never have been necessary. Yet the biggest surprise was still ahead. Before ending the call, Linda mentioned something else. She said the original conflict from decades ago had not even been caused by the woman everyone blamed. According to records, letters, and conversations she remembered, the real source of the family division had been someone else entirely. A man who had quietly encouraged misunderstandings between relatives because it benefited him financially. Several family relationships had collapsed because people accepted rumors instead of asking questions. When the call ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. The revelation felt almost unbelievable. An entire chain of assumptions had traveled across generations, changing shape each time the story was repeated. I looked at Ashley and saw something I had never seen before. Not anger. Not hostility. Regret. Genuine regret. But even as the truth began emerging, another realization settled over me. If Linda was correct, then someone in Ashley's immediate family had spent years passing along a version of events that was deeply flawed. And that meant there was still one person whose role in this story had not yet been fully explained, Ashley's mother. Ashley stared at the dark screen of her phone long after the call had ended. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. In its place was a look of disbelief. Around the table, nobody seemed sure what to say next. Daniel finally broke the silence. He asked the question everyone was thinking. If Linda was right, why had Ashley's mother remained so certain for all these years? Ashley rubbed her forehead and admitted she did not know. Then she quietly said something that caught my attention. A few months earlier, while helping her mother clean out old boxes in the attic, she had found a collection of letters and documents from decades ago. At the time, she had not paid much attention to them because she believed she already knew the story. Now she was not so sure. One of her cousins immediately suggested calling Ashley's mother. Ashley hesitated. The tension in her expression revealed how complicated their relationship had become. Still, after several seconds, she agreed. The call connected after only 2 rings. Ashley's mother, Carol, sounded cheerful at first, unaware of what had happened during dinner. That changed quickly when Ashley explained why everyone was gathered around the phone. Carol listened quietly as Ashley described Linda's version of events. The silence on the other end became noticeably longer with each detail. Finally, Carol let out a slow breath. Her response surprised everyone. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Instead, she admitted there were things she had learned only recently. A few months earlier, while sorting through family records, she had discovered letters written by relatives who had lived through the original conflict. Those letters painted a very different picture from the stories she had heard growing up. According to the letters, the woman everyone blamed had spent years trying to repair damaged relationships. The real source of the division had been a trusted family member who repeatedly spread misleading information between relatives. Carol confessed that she had struggled to accept what she found because it contradicted beliefs she had carried for decades. Ashley looked stunned. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. Carol's voice softened. She said she had intended to. But every time she tried, she felt embarrassed. Admitting she might have been wrong about something so important was difficult. She kept delaying the conversation, assuming there would always be another opportunity. Hearing those words, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because years of misunderstanding could have been avoided. Relief because the truth was finally emerging. Then Carol said something none of us expected. She revealed that she still had photographs, letters, and official records stored at her home. Some of the documents clearly identified the people involved. None of them matched me. Not my name, not my family, not my history. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. I could see the weight of the evening settling over him. For years he had been caught between his wife and his mother without understanding the true cause of the tension. Now the pieces were finally coming together. Ashley thanked her mother for being honest. When the call ended, she remained silent for several seconds. Then she slowly turned toward me. For the first time since I had arrived at the restaurant, there was no suspicion in her eyes. There was only regret. Yet even as the facts became clear, I could tell she was struggling with something deeper. Because correcting a mistake takes only a moment. Accepting that you built years of judgment on that mistake is far more difficult. Ashley finally broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke my name. I looked at her and saw a completely different person from the one who had spent the evening confronting me. The anger was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was someone trying to understand how years of assumptions had led her to this moment. She took a slow breath and apologized. Not with a quick sentence meant to end an uncomfortable situation, but with the kind of apology that comes from genuine reflection. She admitted that she had judged me before truly knowing me. She admitted that every interaction between us had been filtered through stories she believed were true. She said that when I offered advice, she saw manipulation. When I showed concern, she saw control. When I tried to connect with her, she assumed there was some hidden motive. Listening to her, I could hear the weight of years pressing against every word. Daniel remained quiet beside her. I could tell he was processing his own emotions. The realization that misunderstandings had shaped so much of our family dynamic was affecting him too. Ashley continued speaking. She explained that she had convinced herself she was protecting her marriage. Every small disagreement between us had seemed like proof that her suspicions were correct. Instead of asking questions, she collected evidence that supported what she already believed. Looking back, she could now see how unfair that had been. Around the table, the atmosphere had changed completely. The relatives who had earlier seemed ready to support her accusations now appeared deeply uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Others looked at me with expressions that seemed almost apologetic. The entire evening had become a lesson in how quickly assumptions can grow when nobody challenges them. Then Ashley did something that surprised everyone. She stood from her chair and addressed not only me but the entire table. She admitted publicly that she had been wrong. She explained what Linda had revealed and what her mother had confirmed. She made it clear that the stories connecting me to the decades-old conflict were false. Several relatives nodded slowly as she spoke. No one argued. No one questioned the facts anymore. The truth had become impossible to ignore. When she finished, she looked back at me. Her eyes were filled with emotion. She asked if I could ever forgive her. It was not an easy question. Forgiveness sounds simple when people talk about it. In reality, it often arrives after disappointment, hurt, and lost time. I thought about the holidays that felt strained. The phone calls that never happened. The distance that had quietly grown between Daniel and me. None of those things could be erased. Yet as I looked at Ashley, I realized she had spent years trapped by a misunderstanding she did not create. She had made choices that hurt our relationship, but those choices had been built on information she believed was true. I told her that forgiveness was possible. Trust, however, would take time. She nodded immediately. There was no argument. No attempt to defend herself. She simply accepted it. Daniel reached for her hand, and for the first time all evening, I saw relief on his face. The tension that had followed him for so long seemed to loosen. The dinner that had begun with division was ending with honesty. It was not a perfect ending. Too much had happened for that. But it was real. And sometimes real healing matters more than perfect resolutions. As conversation slowly resumed around the table and people finally returned their attention to the meals sitting untouched in front of them, I found myself wondering what our family might look like moving forward. For the first time in a very long time, the answer no longer felt impossible. The evening ended far differently than anyone had imagined when they first arrived. The conversations around the table gradually became quieter and more genuine. People stopped debating the past and started reflecting on it. For the first time in years, it felt as though everyone was looking at the same truth instead of competing versions of it. Daniel eventually stood and raised his glass again. This time there was no tension in the room. He thanked everyone for coming and admitted that the evening had become something far more important than a celebration of his promotion. He said it had become an opportunity for honesty. Hearing that, I felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because my son had shown maturity when it mattered most. Sadness because it had taken so many years for us to reach this point. As people began preparing to leave, Ashley asked if she could speak with me privately for a moment. We stepped away from the table and stood near the entrance of the restaurant. The dining room was quieter now. Most of the dinner crowd had already gone home. Ashley looked nervous. She told me she understood if things could never return to the way they should have been. She said she could not undo years of distance or suspicion. She could not erase the moments when she had assumed the worst about me. But she hoped that one day we might be able to build something better than what we had before. I listened carefully before answering. Then I told her something I had learned many years ago after losing people I loved. Time is one of the few things we never get back. Holding on to resentment often costs more than letting it go. That did not mean forgetting what happened. It did not mean pretending mistakes never existed. It simply meant deciding what kind of future was worth creating. Tears filled her eyes as she thanked me. We returned to the table, and a few minutes later everyone began leaving. Daniel walked me to my car. The night air felt cool and peaceful after the emotional intensity of the evening. Before I got into the driver's seat, he hugged me. This time it was not rushed. It was the kind of hug that reminded me of the little boy I had raised. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. He admitted. There had been many moments when he sensed something was wrong but did not know how to address it. I told him families are complicated and that courage often arrives later than we wish it would. What mattered was that he was willing to face the truth once it appeared. During the drive home, I thought about everything that had happened. The accusations, the misunderstandings, the revelations. It would have been easy to focus only on the pain. Instead, I found myself thinking about something else. How many relationships are damaged not by facts but by assumptions? How many people spend years defending stories they never verified? How many opportunities for connection disappear because nobody asks one more question? Over the following months, things changed slowly. Ashley and I did not become close overnight. Trust is built through consistency, not promises. But she began calling occasionally. We shared lunches. We talked about family history, work, and everyday life. Little by little, the walls between us started coming down. One afternoon nearly a year later, she told me something I will never forget. She said that meeting the real version of me had been one of the most important lessons of her life because it taught her how dangerous assumptions can become when they go unchallenged. Looking back now, I do not remember that evening as the night everything fell apart. I remember it as the night the truth finally arrived. And sometimes the greatest gift truth gives us is not proving who is right or wrong. Sometimes its greatest gift is giving people a second chance to understand one another before it is too late.